Hey, so we're going to talk a little bit about Gidra and this article, The Birth of Amerasia, and we'll learn about this key newsletter and document that was pivotal during the Asian American movement. We'll start with a little bit of background about the Asian American movement itself, the birth of it and the peak of it, and then we'll get into what Gidra is, and then we'll talk about Cincip, the event itself. So, some background. In 1965, the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act was signed into law, and it allowed for Asians to immigrate to the United States. Before this law, they were not allowed to enter the country. Then in 1968, there was the first Asian American Ethnic Studies course that was introduced at San Francisco State University, at the time known as San Francisco State College, and this was born during the Third World Liberation Strike, which was an effort organized by ethnic student groups to protest the lack of diversity and the Eurocentric education that existed in higher education, so colleges and universities. This strike lasted about 5 months, and it inspired a nationwide demand for ethnic studies courses in higher education. Then in 1968, well through the 70s, this was the birth and peak of the Asian American movement, and people of Asian ethnicities all across the country condemned American imperialism, racism, exploitation of people of color as a part of this movement. And here's a little definition for imperialism if you want a reminder for what that means. But basically, a core part of this movement was resonating with quote-unquote third world identities. So people in different Asian communities in the country were brought together by their shared struggles, but also other communities in the country that were suffering at the hand of these same mechanisms, like homeless people, for example, were also yoked in their struggle with this community. And so a lot of the activism and organizing that occurred during the Asian American movement was also to serve a lot of people generally in the community that they felt resonated with these ideals and concepts. So, what is Gidra? Gidra was a student-run newsletter that documented the changes and key events of the Asian American movement. It started in 1969 by 5 college students at UCLA, and they originally wanted it to be a club on campus, but that idea was rejected by college administration. They refused to fund it, so these students had to cough up $100 each to contribute to this mission and create the newsletter themselves. It was pivotal in providing the broader Asian American community the education and terms and key labels that helped people to both understand and navigate the movement as it was happening, but also to verbalize and talk about it with other people. It covered a lot of the strike for the ethnic studies courses that we mentioned earlier. And eventually, this newsletter moved off campus into the Crenshaw district of Los Angeles, and it began to cover more about the anti-imperialist, anti-war effort that was a really big part of the Asian American movement. On the left, you'll see a sample cover from the March 1972 edition of Gidra. So, a big concept that Gidra was all about was this creation of Pan-Asian Americanness. And it was Pan-Asian American in its nature. So what does that mean? It connected the experiences and struggles of all different Asian Americans to each other. It really served this broader concept of unity across all different Asian communities within the country. So once this newsletter had moved off campus, the scope of journalism had opened to include the broader philosophies and concepts that the Asian American movement was really about. And so, for example, Gidra talked about the war in Vietnam, but connected it to the atomic bombing happening in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There were other movements in Asia that included Okinawa, the Philippines, Korea, etc., that also were connected together. They talked about the draft in US that was happening during the Vietnam War, and all these events connected together spoke to a broader anti-imperialism that was really important to the Asian American movement. So, let's talk about Cincip. This is the September 1969 edition of Gidra, and the article in the newsletter you'll see on the right, Birth of Amerasia, is covering the events of Cincip. Cincip was not organized by Gidra, but it was an event that editors and writers of Gidra went to that they then covered. It was a fusion of multiple Asian American organizations that aimed to facilitate a space for community togetherness. And what does that look like? So they had rock bands come and play from all different Asian American groups. They had awards that they gave to couples that were there that were married the longest. They had speeches and speakers. They had dancers and dance groups perform. They had demonstrations, which included like martial arts demonstrations. There were a lot of activities that were trying to inspire this idea of togetherness and reminding people that these cultural experiences are also human experiences. Singing and dancing are things that are core to being a human being. But they also had a lot of speakers come and talk. So one of the speakers was Dr. Thomas Noguchi, and he is a really big person in the Asian American movement and Asian American history. He was the coroner to the stars. So he conducted the autopsies of Marilyn Monroe, Robert F. Kennedy, Janis Joplin, and so many other famous people. But after the Robert F. Kennedy assassination, he was ousted by his county, and this was because of racial discrimination. He was under a lot of scrutiny after the RFK assassination, and then he was forced to resign. So he came and he spoke at Cincip, and one of the quotes from the article says, "He is a symbol of a community that is trying to find its guts and stand up." So while this event was so beautiful with all of the demonstrations that it had, it also showed that it was important to remember this Pan-Asian Americanness was not just restricted to celebrating culture and sharing culture, but also remembering that there is a broader movement at stake that affects all the members of this community. But I think it's important to hear more about this from the people who actually created and edited this newsletter, and I want people to remember that just because we're young adults, that doesn't mean that we can't participate in activism ourselves. The people who created Gidra were young adults, basically teenagers, and these people were able to create such an effect in their community and their movement. And right now is also a big time in activism, and we should not feel like we are held back by our limited access to resources or our age. So I want this video to be educational, but also inspirational.
So we're standing on the corner of 11th Avenue and Jefferson in an area of town called West Side by Japanese Americans, but it's by others it's called the Crenshaw District. This was a number of professional offices, dentists and doctors, and a drugstore when Gidra's office moved into that corner over there at 3108 Jefferson. When we started Gidra, it started on campus at UCLA because most of us that founded it were UCLA students.
Most of the people in Gidra were activists who did a newspaper. They weren't writers who, primarily.
We were involved in ethnic studies, the anti-war movement against the war in Vietnam. I think inevitably it led to a point where we felt like, there was actually a movement. There were people who wanted coverage and reportage about events that were happening that were not in the mainstream media, so we decided to create a newspaper. We didn't have an explicit editorial policy, but we wanted to reflect the ideas, feelings, aspirations of young people who were involved in our movement at the time.
We really resisted creating these hierarchies.
There was no such thing as these people are members of the editorial staff. This is the general manager, this is the editor-in-chief. There are no titles like that.
That was always a struggle, trying to get a group consensus among 18, 20 individuals, I found to be impossible.
If you stay up until 4 or 5 in the morning every night and yell at each other, scream at each other, struggle with each other, and produce something, that's how you really bond through struggle. We were activists in the movement, we had jobs, we were going to school, we were doing this. And we were doing this not as a 2, 4, 10-hour a week thing. We were doing this as a 40, 50, 60 hours a week thing.
The paper never made any money. That's what we never got paid.
We tried to sell it, for a quarter, but we would also give it away whenever there was a big gathering. We'd, bring stacks of it, because the main thing was to get the word out.
A lot of people went through those doors. A lot of people helped out. I think Mike did a count one time, and it was in the hundreds.
I think we have the best collection of illustrators in the movement.
The most effective way to get across an idea is not necessarily to write a long article about it. You had to deliver the message in a palatable way, a way that people could relate to it. So I think that was kind of the inspiration for using so many graphics and trying to illustrate things in ways other than just text.
In order to get justified columns, you have to type it once, unjustified, and calculate the number of spaces that you'd have to add in between the words to get a justified copy. So everything that's in the paper that is justified was typed at least twice.
And then we had to paste the columns onto paper over a box lit up from behind and use like X-Acto knives to make corrections.
So that was a painstaking kind of thing to do. I look back on it, it was pretty amazing, I think, that a group of essentially teenagers, starting this thing and keeping it going for 5 years, every month.
It was all questioning and challenging and trying to create something new and something better than the way it was.
Here today, 37 years later, most of us are very close friends. Most of us are still involved in some form of activism or community or some organization, some charitable purpose. And I think we didn't burn out, we didn't get cynical, we're still hopeful, we're still, trying to do things to fit the conditions of today.
Thank you so much for listening. That's my presentation. I hope it was inspirational, but also enlightening to you to learn more about the movement and also this super important, super cool newsletter.